Good morning, friends. I'm back to Ranchi, and it's a very pleasant morning here. It's cloudy outside, it has been raining here, so it's quite pleasant. Let us continue our studies in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. If you remember, last time we discussed about Paul being boasting about the rights of an apostle because somewhere he has been hurt and he is challenging the church at Corinth. And basically, he's saying, in verse 4, don't we have the right to food and drink? Don't we have the right to take a believing wife along with us to other apostles and the Lord's brothers and Cephas? Or is it only I had Barnabas who must work for a living? And also, he quotes Moses in verse 9. He says, for it is written in the law of Moses, do not muzzle an ox while it is treading out the grain. So he's saying, he has the right to get financial help from the church that he planted, the Christians, the believers that he mentored. And verse 12, he even questions, if others have this right of support from you, shouldn't we have all the more? But as soon as we see verse 12 and verse 15, there is a turning point. It's a very powerful thought that he leaves behind. And I want you to notice that in verse 12, 15, because that's a very significant quality of a leader or Christian leader. David Prior, in his commentary in the Good Books, the Bible Society Today BSC series, he writes on page 156, he says, a timeless challenge. Paul throws a challenge to all the Christian leaders forever to come. Let me read, what he writes, David Prayers. I quote from page 156. Paul makes a completely contradictory case, and in so doing builds up an approach to the ministry of the gospel, which is a timeless challenge to everyone called to share in the gospel. We will take each statement in sequence. And then he quotes verse 12 and 15. Let me read verse 12 and 15. In verse 12, starts in the second clause, the very important keyword, but, B-U-T. But we did not use this right. On the contrary, we put up with anything rather than hinder the gospel of Christ. Then verse 15 again begins with the same word, conjunction, very important, but. But I have not used any of these rights, and I'm not writing this in the hope that you will do such things for me. Paul, in other words, is saying, if I'm boasting about, and if I'm trying to remind you of the rights of an apostle, I'm not doing so because I am greedy for money or I'm expecting such help. Rather than he says, I do not want to use this right. I like when he, particularly verse 16, he says, yet when I preach the gospel, I cannot boast, for I am compelled to preach. Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. If I preach voluntarily, I have a reward. If not voluntarily, I am simply discharging the trust committed to me. What then is my reward? Just this, that in preaching the gospel, I may offer it free of charge, and so not making use of my rights in preaching it. In other words, Paul is saying, I am here to serve you, not because I am expecting you to pay to me or give me my due rights, but I am doing so because I have a sense of calling. The love of God compels me, and I am doing this voluntary service. I forgo all my rights. So according to David Prior, it's a challenge to the Christian leaders that there are times when you have the rights and yet you desire voluntarily to forgo those rights, and you serve not because that the reward motivates you or because the privileges or the rights that you have, but because the love of God compels, and you do so voluntarily. That is what is so important. David Prior says the Corinthians expected an imperative apostle impressive, sorry. The Corinthians expected an impressive apostle to be very firm on his rights. But Paul makes a completely contradictory case. May God find in us the similar attitude, a similar approach where people, when when they see us, expecting us something, and yet they find opposite of someone who is willing to serve because he loves God. May God help us. Blessings.